And good evening, everybody. Charles Moscowitz here. Michael D. Shaw is my guest. Welcome to the show. Mike, I released a short book, a treatise, if you will,
Aha.
based on my studies in Islamic studies at Arizona State. We had to write a final paper, and I turned mine into a little book and published it. I focused on the Israel-Arab conflict. Can there be peace, given what I was studying? And already there's some interest. So tomorrow I'm going to be on with Brett Winterby
Oh,
from,
good.
where's he? He's at a radio station in Charlotte, WBT. I'll be on at 4:30. And, it's a topic that I feel I've got a little skin in the game on. I've been to Israel many times. I'm interested in this. And I base it on 3 source documents, 2 of which were the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyad Qutb and Hassan al-Banna, both of Egypt. And then I brought in as my third source, Yara Hawari, who was a young woman who's involved with this Palestine Policy Network, and examined all 3 of their papers and drew my conclusions because their ideas represent, I think, a very dominant view, or at least a big view in the Middle East, in the Arab and Muslim countries, and that these views have formed an unholy alliance with the radical left all over the world. And in a sense, it's the old axis that it goes back in history, of course, but it was expressed in the 1930s and 40s with this Islamic Nazi alliance, and then after World War II with the Islamic Soviet alliance. And it is not going to make peace with Israel or the United States because ideologically, philosophically, morally, it is the exact opposite of what we stand for, which is national sovereignty and Judeo-Christian moral values. Now,
And that's right. And nothing has really changed since the late 1940s, has it?
No, it's the same. They keep rearing their head again and reemerging, and it's the same war against this behemoth, this radical view, much of which is, of course, funded by the very wealthiest people in the world. And I noticed that, like in the case of the 2 Muslim Brotherhood figures, they, in a sense, socially speaking, they're very conservative. They stand for the conservative moral values that we might equate with American conservatism. But they also are jihadists in that they want to export their view to the rest of the world. And they are very similar to certainly the communist movement and, I would argue, the Nazi movement, in that they want to have world order. So I don't think that we as Westerners, as it were, can point too accusatory a finger at them, because we've had our own movements that have this agenda. We want to impose our way of life, our views on the world, create a one world order, a one world government, maybe formally or informally. And they viewed in their day, they viewed both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and they both identified that as kinship with their views. However, their difference was that the Nazi movement and the communist movement were atheist. They didn't believe in God, so they were incomplete. And yet they, as followers of Allah and Muhammad as the prophet, they did believe in God. Thus, they were completed in their desire to create this world order that would bring all the wonderful things that they all think they're going to bring, peace and love and unicorns and all the great joys of the universe.
Well, with all due respect, I'm not sure that the Islamic concept of God is exactly the same as Judeo-Christian.
Oh, it's clearly not. And this is something, I'm glad you brought that up because it's very subjective. First of all, their belief in Allah is very distant. It's not revealed. It becomes essentially whatever they want it to be, and they'll acknowledge that they believe that the earthly powers, the Ummah, what they call it, get to decide what God believes. In the same way that Muhammad himself was a military dictator and a warlord who decided what God said in order to fit the needs of the time. Toward the end of his life, he put in a lot of warlike messages from God. I'm hearing voices from God that as he prepared to go to war against the Byzantines in Constantinople, suddenly he had a mandate from God to do this. So it depends on who's in power in Arab and Islamic countries, how that's interpreted. And they do depend on either strong, powerful governments that control, the whole apparatus of government, not democratic. That's a Western idea that they view as corrupting. And that those strong governments are either tribal in the form of like Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states, or they're dictators. And the only way that peace can come about and where it can work is if that strong government decides to interpret the Quran and the Hadith in a way that promotes peace. And that can happen. And I'll use the example of Egypt. For a while, you had the Muslim Brotherhood take over Egypt during the Arab Spring.
Exactly.
Egypt suddenly became radicalized. They wanted to launch jihad against the West. They threatened Israel. Israel responded to them by saying, okay, if you want to have war against us, we're going to reoccupy Sinai. And they backed down because they knew that Israel meant business. But nevertheless, they were moving in a radical direction until a general, El-Sisi, stepped up and put them in prison where they belong. Both Hassan al-Banna and Sayyad Qutb were suppressed by Nasser, and they were both executed, which is really, I suppose, a strong way of dealing with this, but they understood this threat that the dictator gets to decide, not the radical interpretation. And the dictator can keep the peace and has kept the peace. That's true in the case of Turkey with Erdogan. As bad as he may be, and we may not agree with him, he does keep the peace because he believes that's in the interest of his country and because he sees a Western system that's still strong enough to oppose him. Gaddafi, he wanted to create strong sovereign states in Africa. He wanted to create a new currency for Africa. That's why the Obama administration started dropping bombs and killed him, which of course is wrong because he actually was moving toward nationalism and sovereignty in an African and in an Arab context. So my conclusion is that if you have strong states that interpret the Quran in such a way that you can have peace, and they can have their conservative purity. It's a very purified system. If that's what they want, that's their right, even if we don't really agree with their system at all. What they do to women is horrible, but if that's what the people...
Well, at least they're being pragmatic about it.
Yeah.
That you can operate in a semi-Western format. And of course, the great irony, which nobody talks about except you and me, is that it's Western civilization, essentially based on, later Western civilization based on the church, but certainly Judeo-Christian tradition.
Right.
And there's nothing Islamic in that sense about any of those countries, at least in terms of how they work, infrastructure and so on. But that doesn't seem to matter somehow. I doubt that too many of them really want to go back to the 7th century.
Well, in a sense, like al-Banna and Qutb, they did want to go back to the 7th century in terms of like the laws and the customs, but at the same time, they completely embraced modern science and technology.
Yeah, of course.
which is fine. And they said that's fine because that's all the will of Allah. My comment to them is that if they want to have a society like that, they have a right to have it. They can deal with the consequences of it. But where the Western democracies have to draw the line is on jihad. That they can't have. They
Right.
can impose whatever they want on their countries, as miserable as it may be, and as much as it may to a reasonable extent. Saudi Arabia, they want to have, or they, Iran for that matter, they want to have women walking around in these like telephone booths. Then that's what they want. That's what they can have. We would be hypocritical to not say that sovereign nations shouldn't determine their own culture and their own way of life. And if that's what they view as the Islamic way of life, then they can have it. The problem
is it doesn't impose on the Straits of Hormuz.
Well, that's the point. The problem is that once they step outside of the national border and they try to use force to impose it or civilizational control to enforce it, like immigration, on non-Muslim countries or even moderate Muslim countries, that is where the Western democracies have to draw the line. They are importing or exporting their jihad both in force by bombing people and by committing acts of terror, but also through immigration. Millions of Muslims settling in Europe and in American cities with this high birth rate, and they expect eventually to overtake these cities and these states and these countries. And they're pretty open about that. I'm not saying every Muslim is involved. Most of them aren't actually, but they're not speaking up. The ones that aren't are afraid to speak up too loudly. And there is this core that is involved in what's called civilizational jihad, peacefully settling countries. And that has to be stood up to.
Right. I mean, that's very nice, but it hasn't been, has it?
Right.
And
No, because it's the weakness of the West. And one of the only countries that has stood up to it is, of course, the state of Israel. And that's why Israel is despised, not just by the Muslim jihadists, but also by the international left and the international establishment. The international establishment, and it's interesting because particularly Hassan al-Banna, very good thinker and very good writer, even if I disagree, but he points out that the British Empire, this is before World War II, was just as bad as the communists and the Nazis in its attempt to create a world order without God. And I think that was true. But what I think needs to be said is that after World War II and after the collapse of European powers, that colonial system was replaced by the informal international system that was set up by Cecil Rhodes and by the United Nations and the Council on Foreign Relations and all that stuff that the Birch Society identified. It's an informal form of Western international colonialism.
But is it also realistic, okay, that they see this coming and they deny it and they use excuses like, well, that would be racist or whatever to attempt to deal with it? Now, I'm beginning to think, because of the inaction of any of these European countries, that they're somehow have a death wish and really want it to be like that because they haven't done a damn thing about it. Let's be honest.
Well, they're controlled by these same international forces that seek an informal world order by abolishing or getting rid of functional, independent, sovereign states, turning them into kind of viceroys or provinces, so very much like what the British colonial powers did to India or the French did to Southeast Asia and Africa. They want to turn it into an informal world order. And the state of Israel, regardless of what individual Jews think, because they're often part of this, nevertheless, they stand for sovereignty in a sense that is much more vigorous, probably than any nation in the world, because they're under attack and they have to fight to survive. And the result is that you have this ethos of strong nationalism. We're going to save the lives and the safety and the property of our nation and of our people from a foreign threat. And that's why well, first of all, they're despised by the radical Islamists who see an Islamic world order, but they're also despised by the radical left, which has this informal, and the internationalist establishment, which is either left or right, which sees this idea of an informal world order. The nationalism is what makes Israel stand out. And the other factor, of course, is religion, in that Israel is, as a Jewish state, even if the people are not openly religious, there is still this idea that they are fulfilling the Torah. Now, Christians may disagree here, and that's fine, but in the Jewish sense, we're commanded to take possession of that tiny little miserable swath of land. And that in order to do that, it's to create the stage for a greater age, a messianic age. And that is despised by the international left, which wants to overthrow God. And
but let's talk about individual people. All right.
Yeah.
How does all this comport with the average British guy on the street that's seeing the way London has changed since when I was, I've been there many times. So I remember I was there in the 90s, and the change already in the early 2000s. And you're looking around and say, it's all different. What's the reaction of the individual person? They mostly, what can they do? But they've been betrayed by their own leadership. And to what end? What do these soy boy leaders of these Western European countries think they're going to get out of all this? Going down to history as rooting your own country. I truly don't understand the motivation. I mean, how many cocktail parties can you be invited to make that worthwhile?
They are betraying Europe. And the late Italian writer Arianna Fallaci, herself a leftist, wrote an excellent book about this before she passed away, where she said we have to stop Islamic immigration if we're going to save Europe. And I think that Giorgia Meloni realizes it in Italy. And she made some incredible statements recently, and she's backing that up with action. And the question, I suppose, is it too late? You have a movement in Europe now that is starting to rear its head. Certainly Eastern Europe is not part of this at all. There you have countries that appreciate sovereignty after having been under the jackboot of communism for so many decades. They're getting rid of that. They want to preserve their sovereign rights as a people, and that includes their culture, their ethnic background, all of it. And they have a right to do that. That's a basic. But Western Europe has become soft. Particularly, I've noticed Spain for some reason.
How do you explain the self-hatred that must exist? Because number one, they're not reproducing, and number two, they're allowing replacement. So where does that come from?
It's look. I mean, Pete Peterson, the head of the New York Federal Reserve, wrote a book about this in the 90s. He actually said it on my program when he was doing book interviews, where he said that Western Europe is contracting population-wise because of abortion and families being smaller and people getting married later, and just the population is decreasing, and yet they have these big welfare states which have to support retirees who have pensions, and they have to keep the machine rolling. They've got America subsidizing them. And I think that their partial intention was to bring in these immigrants to do work and create income and generate enough economic activity that they could continue on with their system. Now, that hasn't happened in that they're not creating income. They're all on welfare. And
that's right. That's kind of the same thing to a smaller extent that's happening here. Okay, fine. Bring in all these Somali immigrants, and what did you get? Some huge percentage on welfare and or criminal activity.
Exactly. And it's sort of, I don't know if you've seen some of the videos of Brandon Gill, congressman from Texas.
Yeah.
He's done some incredible work in terms of interview. He brought in when they had on, I think, Tim Walz and some of these Minnesota officials.
The Leering Center.
The Leering Center. He goes, have the Somali people contributed to your state? And they're like, of course they have. And then he pulls out his paper and he says, well, let's see. 60% are on welfare. 70% don't speak English. I mean, he goes down a list of facts. And yet they're calling him racist and they're yelling and
this is
heads are exploding.
Before. This is all they have left. I mean, if you go back 50 years, when this whole liberal mindset unfolded, they're really true believers. I mean, look at the reaction to the repeal of the Voting Rights Act. All right.
Right.
And there was an article by a guy that I hate that the LA Times features all the time, Chemerinsky.
Mm-hmm. Oh, he's a lawyer and he's a professor at
UC Berkeley Law School.
Yeah.
So, it's all over and it's terrible and no blacks are going to vote and whatever the hell it was. So, but they're really seeing deep down, as we've discussed, that this whole paradigm doesn't work. That's why they're so upset.
And not only that, but I mean, that's sheer politics because according to most recent polls, more black voters are voting for Trump than any Republican since Eisenhower.
So maybe they should be in favor of suppressing that. I don't know.
Yeah, but the point is that, the blacks are going to be voting plenty and black candidates are going to get elected. Republican black candidates are going to get elected. I mean, so, that's it's just, that's, if you take a look at, the redistricting maps, I get it. I mean, they had gerrymandered black districts to get Democrats elected, and they're losing that. And that's their heads are blowing up over that. That's what this comes down to.
Well, I mean, what's funny to me is that they based their entire system on fraud.
I mean,
why don't you actually come up with something good? It's either voter fraud, electoral map fraud, but how about just some policies that people actually like? I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine in Florida, Jewish guy, and he was complaining about how the hell did all these New York Jews vote for Mondani? And I said, it's very simple. They're liberals first and Jews second or fifth.
Right.
And I don't understand it, but there it is.
You mentioned self-haters in Europe. These are self-hating Jews and self-hating Americans. I mean, it's a it's a ghetto mentality. That the Jews felt insecure for thousands of years, given that they lost their sovereignty. So they kiss up to the powers that be automatically. They become like, they try to befriend authority. And as a result, they support authoritarianism, as a protector. The European prince would protect the Jews, and the Jews would try to make themselves useful to the prince by getting involved.
Until a new prince comes in, and then it doesn't seem to work.
And a new prince comes in, exactly. And they've loaned money to the prince, which he loves. But then a new guy comes in and he said, hey, we don't want to pay this debt. So they off with their heads. They'll confiscate the property. So it's a double-edged sword, obviously. I think Jews in America have become so arrogant that they don't realize that it's a double-edged sword, but it is. You look at the Jews of Germany were prosperous until Adolf Hitler came in power. I'm just saying, I'm not saying that's going to happen here, but I only note that these people are really out of touch with reality. They live in some kind of a bubble. It's crazy. I mean, I hear them, they're complaining about the war in Iraq. I mean, they're almost mimicking the worst kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Oh, Trump is controlled by the Jews, and it's really awful. But so my pamphlet is available for anyone who'd like to go to Amazon. It's called The Israel-Arab Conflict. Will there be peace? And my answer is only, to use Reagan's famous statement, peace through strength.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, sure, there'll be peace, but it has to be with a Western powers that understand who they are and are willing to stand up for their civilization. And the Islamic and Arab countries respect that. The Israelis know that. They know that if you had like an Arab militia come in and kill 5 Israelis in an attack, Israel would strike back, and they would find the people who did it and they'd take them out. And they were very good at it. And eventually the Arab countries came to respect that. They respect.
Same thing happened with the Barbary pirates, right? That was when Jefferson, tried to do it diplomatically. Well, why are you guys doing this? Well, because the Quran says that we can't. Oh, okay. Then they went in and beat the crap out of them, and that was that. But
exactly, and that's and then they respect that.
Yeah.
But they don't respect weakness, and you have to. And if you are strong, not only are you going to keep them at bay in their sovereign states, and these are vast, oil-rich countries. I mean, it's not like these these aren't people who need to go to the West. They could take over their own countries, and if they want to have a radical, Islamic way, as they call it, there's an Arab word for it. I don't remember it right now. Then fine, let them do it, as long as they don't, again, try to impose it on others. And Israel's been successful when they have stood up. The other thing I noticed, because I get into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, each week in my class, we would have a module to focus on a particular aspect of Islam. And in one week, of course, they focused on feminism. What is like how women are going to do in Islamic countries? Are they getting feminine, the pietist movement and all? And it's interesting. It's fine. The thing that I noticed in the movie we had to watch, and I don't think they meant this in the movie, it was an inadvertent observation. It followed an Islamic female judge in her daily life and how she was making decisions. And they noted that she was the first female Islamic judge in history. And she was able to bring in a protege, another woman, who also was appointed as a judge. And they showed her working in the courts and how effective she was. And this is such a great development for women. But what they didn't notice is that she's a judge in Ramallah, which is in Judea and Samaria, what's called the West Bank, in Israel. Right. And the fact is that would it not maybe occur to them that the reason why women in the Arab and Islamic society of the Palestinian Authority have done well is because they're under the control of Israel, not under the control of the mullahs, not under the control of other Islamic countries where women don't get to become judges, they don't get to develop rights. It showed women engaged in high-powered positions, prosperous women who are making a good living, professionals, But it happened in Israel, not in Syria, not in Turkey. And the fact is that this is another example of where Islamic society can work if it has authority.
But I wonder, Chuck, how many people noticed that besides you?
Nobody noticed.
The reason it was
Italians noticed it. The people who made this movie weren't thinking this either.
Well, no, maybe they were. I mean, that was the only example that they could find.
That's the point. And the fact is that that the Palestinian Authority under Israel, in spite of all of the conflicts and some of the hotheads that are, involved with terrible things, I agree with you on that. I mean, I agree with them on that. That's bad. Israel needs to do a better job. But the fact is that in spite of those things, the Arabs of what I call Judea and Samaria are fairly prosperous and fairly free and fairly democratic because of Israeli authority, because they mimic Israel and they're influenced by Israel.
Well, that's right. That's the 500-pound gorilla in the room. You
Yeah,
see, we're
and
hoping you're not going to notice that.
that's right. And at the end of the film, they showed the men in the Ramallah Palestinian Authority headquarters. They have this wonderful judicial chambers, and they were in their robes, and they're having a ceremony. That is happening because of Israel. It wouldn't happen in Iraq or in Iran. It's sort of so. The solution, in my mind, for the Palestinian-Israeli question is already there. It's called the Palestinian Authority, which, in spite of its problems and in spite of its corruptions, has actually worked fairly well. It actually has functioned. They've had elections, which they probably shouldn't because they'll elect Hamas. But the point is they've had they already did in Gaza, exactly what happened.
Yeah.
But, under Israeli auspices and with Israel handling the bigger questions of security, of foreign policy, of, like regulation of citizenship, they function quite well in the broader context. They have more freedoms than they do probably in most, if not all, other Islamic countries. So I think Israel needs to step up and notice this itself and say, hey, the Palestinian question has been answered. The Palestinian Authority, headquartered in Ramallah, which, by the way, is a prosperous city. You see these guys with their great cars and their suits. I mean, this is not a poor place. They've got hotels. They've got businesses. That is the solution. Let them have that. And at the same time, they need to work out the fact that you're going to have Jews living there as well. And
of course, the problem is that I don't think it's going to go over too well. So the answer to the Arab-Israeli conflict is turn everything into Israel. May not be.
No, you turn Israel into Israel. Let them do their thing. They don't want to have women judges. That's their business. They want to put women into burqas. They want to throw homosexuals off the rooftop. It's their business if that's the society they want, because that reflects, their people. I mean, that's what they're about. It's, if we're going to respect national sovereignty, we have to say, as bad as that is, that's their business. But Israel is Israel's business. And in Israel, the Arab population is doing fine. Now, that doesn't mean that maybe Israel could do some sort of a deal with Jordan, because after all, the people of what's called the West Bank, they were Jordanian citizens before Israel conquered the region in 1967. And just as a side note, I should note that Israel conquered the region because Jordan invaded Israel. In 67. They actually, I have, this maybe is an anecdote, but I have a cousin who's had a young family in Jerusalem at the time. And it was very scary. You had people invading, with machine guns, and it was almost like an October 6th kind of a situation.
Yeah.
Until Israel then turned the tide and they drove them out, and they were victorious in terms of taking over that region. So Israel won the war, and that's the way it goes. They were the aggressors. They didn't have to invade Israel. Israel actually asked them not to, but they did. And so they lost. That's just a sidebar. But the fact is that since then, Israel has been in control of the region, and they can have some kind of a citizenship within that context, and they do. So that's when they talk about the two-state solution, there already is. There's a state of Israel, and there's a Palestinian Authority, which has certain authority, just as it says. Yeah. That is within commensurate to functioning under Israeli auspices. That is the only solution. And if you give them complete sovereignty like they did in Gaza, look what happened. They ended up defeating the Palestinian Authority with violence. Several hundred people were killed. And then they turned Gaza into into a military site to attack Israel with missiles and terror tunnels. They built this incredible network of tunnels. I don't know, it's like a football field size rooms underground. They took all the money that had poured into that region, including American dollars, and while they could have turned that into like this fantastic sovereign state that would look like Singapore, instead they used all the money to set up a war machine to fight Israel. And that's what happened, and Israel won. And so there you have it. I mean, they can't go back now. You know, I mean, I see pictures from the anti-Israel crowd of the devastation in Gaza, and it's sad that people had that happen, but they chose that war.
Well, not only choose that war, the thing that promotes this, unfortunately, this ridiculous Marxist concept of the victim and the oppressor. And the more Israel wins, the more they're the oppressor. And it's just incredible how many people still believe in this Marxist dialectic. It just blows the mind how that has poisoned the intellect of the West since what, the 1840s and Marx?
Yeah. It's critical theory. The world is divided up between, it's the central conspiracy theory of Marxism. The world is divided up between a power that controls all the wealth and that secretly sets up realities that will suppress and oppress the poor.
Right.
And you know, it's what's in colleges. It's very dominant. You know, when you have like the kind of the dual theory, the Manichean theory, there's a grain of truth to it. So they exploit that by defining it and telling us what it is and putting everybody in these categories. But it's false. It's like Israel's actually, and if you really want to look at that, Israel is really on the defensive in that way, because Gaza had huge, I mean, talk about money. I mean, the heads of Gaza, there were three of them, these three guys, they weren't there. They were living in Bahrain or Qatar. Each of them is worth over $2 billion.
Yeah.
I mean, Arafat was worth billions of dollars. I mean, they did siphon off the money, very corrupt, and they were using their own people as like human shields in their war. You know, it's a horrible thing. They say, "Oh, how the Israelis are so cruel." No, Israel had to fight a guerrilla power in an urban setting where they were using their own people. I mean, you know, when they started to find these tunnels, the tunnel entrance would be like in a child's bedroom or in a kindergarten, you know, where they would find with toys and with children. They were building the tunnel underneath that. And they actually were hoping, I mean, I don't know if the individuals were, but they were hoping that people would be killed because they could use that as propaganda against the Israelis, which is exactly what they did. And that's exactly what was.
Not only that, that's been a strategy forever. And the media just seems to lap it up.
Well, because they were schooled in critical theory. You know, and
but I have to ask you this. And you're taking college courses now.
Right.
At what point does the student actually have a brain and say, no, this is wrong?
I haven't seen it in my courses. Now, in my courses, because it's an online college,
right,
one of the components is we do this Yellow Dig app where we're asked a question and you write a short essay to answer that question based upon our readings and the lecture from the professor and the various articles. And then you get to comment on other people's answers. And so I get to see what people are thinking. And they're just all very conforming to the point of view that is given by the class. That, you know, it all comes down to what do they think of women's rights? What do they think about colonialism? All that stuff. And there's very little, I mean, I express myself on that. And in one of the classes, I had a huge response.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I mean, people's heads were blowing off over it. But it's all. And I called the teacher out on referring to Israel as having engaged in a genocide. That was the one.
There you go.
Oh yeah, no, I had to stand up and say something, and I sent him a direct email. I didn't want to publicly shame him because, that's not how I play. But he responded to me rather hotly that it is a genocide and that's his position. And I gave my position. What more can you do? But that is the predominant view there. That's the propaganda from the left, and of course from people on the right, like E. Michael Jones, which has his own motivation. He wants the Jews are Christ killers, so they're evil. But the point is that that's not the main view anymore. The main view is this Marxist Islamist alliance. And if you look at the writings of my two sources here, plus that woman who's the Palestinian rights woman, it's very Marxist. She goes on and on about indigenous rights. I completely debunk that in my book. You can read the book. It's a brief book in that, but putting aside the fact that indigenous claims are a very complicated thing. The Israeli claim to indigenous rights in that small country are very real, and they're better than the claim by the Arabs. And that's my position on it. And I get into it. It's too big a subject to get into here, but the whole idea is idiotic. I mean, at the beginning of the class, we had to sign a land declaration for Native Americans in Arizona that we honor the fact that they were there. And I responded by saying, which Native American tribe are we talking about? The Apaches, who actually were quite violent and who suppressed other tribes and enslaved them and engaged in terrible things? Which tribe are we, you know what I mean? It's like, it's a complicated question. It's, and plus Mexico, of course, is racially very mixed. It's both Hispanic and Native. It's not like, it's not an issue of indigenous anything. Plus the Aztecs, of course, who were the indigenous people, were so brutal and so violent that they welcomed Cortez when he showed up with open arms, to rescue them from that. I mean, they were those pyramids in Teotihuacan, which are beautiful to look at. Those are human sacrifice temples, right? They were covered with
somehow that's skimmed over.
Oh, I mean, they were red with blood. They still are. This was a very violent, warlike, radically, total war, violent society, and a lot of them were even in North America. I understand that there's like a mound outside of St. Louis, the Cahokia Mound, I think it's called. And recent archaeological findings is discovering that there are the skeletons of thousands of children in that. I mean, they were obviously sacrificed. I mean,
child sacrifice was a big deal, in the Middle East too.
Oh yeah. Well, so the point is that indigenosity is not always such a legitimate, claim to glory. And briefly, the only other two examples I gave is the Ainu people of Japan were the indigenous people of Japan, and they were white. And that the Japanese today were Chinese. They came over on ships and they colonized Japan, and they drove out the Ainus, probably in a pretty violent way. And now today the Ainus only are like in the very northern island, and they're generally not well-to-do people. I mean, they're kind of, so it's not a racial matter. Same thing in South Africa. The original peoples of Southern Africa they weren't black. They weren't white, but they were like, it's kind of a race, like an Asian race. And they were driven out by black tribes like the Bantus and the Zulus, who came in with force and drove them out, and probably did so in a brutal manner. And they came in around the same time, or maybe shortly before, the Dutch began to settle South Africa. This is like 16th century. I mean, it's, so you have arguments about who's really indigenous. Today, the original indigenous people are the Hutus and the what is it, the Hottentots. I think that's, they live in Southwest Africa, and they were very much driven off their land by Black Africans. So, it's a complicated subject, is my point. And to try to weaponize
it always comes down to conquest, right? That's how it's always going to be. Human nature.
That's how most nations in the world were formed. Look at Great Britain, right? The original country was Romano-Celtic, and you had Germanic tribes, the Anglo-Saxons, basically invade, and they didn't do it with kindness either, right? I mean, they came in with swords, and they drove the Celtics. That today they're the Welsh, right? They have that little area left, which was mountainous and not great agriculturally. So they held on to one corner of the British island. I only note this. I mean, France, Germanic tribes, the Franks, invaded Rome. I mean, they colonized. They crossed the Rhine River because all of a sudden there was a cold snap, and the river was frozen over, and they're like, "Hey, we can cross." And they hoarded across the Rhine River, and they created the Frankish kingdom, which eventually became France. So, I mean, all people, I mean, you could look at this.
Well, this is all correct, but it doesn't comport with this stupid critical theory notion that these college students lap up. And if you even raise the simple question, you talk about the U.S., well, which tribe? Was it the Apache, where the Comanches attacked the Apaches? Or was it the Navajos came in? Who's the original good guys? And the point is, nobody was a good guy.
No, I mean, and look, I mean, there certainly were atrocities committed by the English settlers. There's no getting away from that. But and in a sense, just to wrap up, in Europe, probably the only indigenous people in Europe are the Basques. That's the only had been there before anybody kind of decided to move in. And they have a language apparently and a DNA that is separate from all other European people. It's one of these mysteries. So I'm just noting that this is an issue that, there's some legitimacy, I suppose. Israel claims, the Jews claim indigenous rights to Israel, and I think they make a good case for it. But ultimately, it's one of these hot potatoes that has to be viewed in a context that is unique to the particular group that's making the claim. And it is one of these things that's been weaponized by the left. So what else is going on?
Well, I referred to another liberal thing.
Yeah.
I was having a bet with my wife as to when the LA Times would finally publish an article on the takedown of the SPLC.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was just conspicuous by the absence of any coverage.
Oh,
well, sure enough, yesterday on Sunday, there was a piece. And the whole thing, the entire focus of the article was not on the corruption of the SPLC, but the fact that, oh no, if you take down these guys, who's going to monitor all these hate groups? That was it. That was the whole article.
They didn't talk about the corruption. They didn't talk about
not at all.
The fact that these hate groups, that they propped them up all these years, that they basically manufactured the Charlottesville attack.
Well, I mean, so you begin to understand the mentality of the leftist media. It's, as my late friend Vin Lewis used to say, ultimately, it's entertainment value. All right. There was a piece on decrying the fact that they're going after this lieutenant of Fauci's. And he starts talking about, everybody knows that the gain of function research causing COVID has been debunked. It's like, what? I mean, that's exactly what happened.
That's a complete lie.
No, it's just, you marvel at, as the expression goes, their head so far up their ass, as they say. How could that even happen?
they're just so sure that they besides operating in a bubble, they're so sure that they're going to get away with it. There's this professor at Harvard, Snyder, Timothy Snyder, I'll mention his name. He's still pushing the Russia collusion theory.
Yeah.
Still coming out with, and Trump is Hitler and all this stuff. I mean, it's like nothing's changed. I've had some exchanges with him on Twitter before Twitter canceled me, by the way. But probably he was behind that. But, I'm like, hey, why don't you leave your office and read some news once in a while?
Well, I mean, Chuck, he can get away with it. Look at Jimmy Kimmel. All right.
Oh my God.
He can get away with it because he's daring the network to cancel him. Right. He has nothing going except Trump hatred. He's got no talent. And then when you see, again, the letters to the LA Times, how do they go after the satirist? Satirist, he doesn't write any of his own material. He's a moron. You could get anybody. I could pick up a random high school kid, put him in front of a camera, have him memorize the lines that Kimmel's writer. Anybody could do that. All right. So, but he's taking advantage of the fact that if ABC were to cancel him, of course they're not going to, because then they're succumbing to the evil Trump. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because who the hell watches those shows anyway? I mean, if you actually have a job, how do you watch a show that goes from 11:30 to 1 a.m.?
Yeah, I mean, and now, of course, the new hero is none other than former FBI Director Comey.
Oh, yeah.
Trump is going after him because of some seashells, they say.
Yeah.
Really? This is the FBI director going out with a direct threat. And it's not just that, it's some other things. And now it's interesting. I mean, the Bar Association guy is threatening Todd Blanche. He's like, he said about him on one of the Sunday talk shows, you had better watch your step, he says. In other words, he'll get disbarred like Trump's lawyer, what was his name? Eastman, who was disbarred for questioning the 2020 election. Now, this is what they do. I mean, these bar associations are so left wing. I mean, when Trump was being prosecuted in the lawfare cases, he had some lawyers had to tell him, I can't take this case because they're going to destroy my career. They're threatening me. And he had trouble getting representation because they're going out to Giuliani.
Well, the problem here is this is another example of how we just have to crush academia. All right. They destroyed public health. They're trying to destroy the legal system. Fine. Go ahead and be a professor. Live in your little bubble. But why should you have any influence at all? I don't know. I don't understand it. I can tell you this. Most lawyers and real doctors I know hate academic lawyers and doctors when they're not, actively ignoring it. But yet there's a weird prejudice in society that somehow all the structure of these fields has to be dominated by these guys. I've never understood it.
It was a movement in the early 20th century where you had the establishment take over these fields and start to control licensing and certificates and the education and the colleges. I mean, if you study, like, for example, Sigmund Freud, that's what he did with psychology. We're going to make this into a science. We're going to organize it. We're going to set up an association. We're going to get paid. We're going to figure out how much money to make. And we're going to get into the universities and create departments that give certificates, and that those are departments that we're going to control. We're going to decide what constitutes psychology. Same thing happened as a professionalism, a kind of a credentialism movement. That really
But the difference with Freud is he was actually seeing patients. he was a real doctor.
Right. Well,
And
that's right.
he created psychiatry that didn't exist then. He was
Sure.
a neurologist, and
Well,
he
it
then
led
created
to
this.
the Fauci's of the world. Eventually, you have now
Well,
at
that's
home.
the other problem. In this article, they refer to Fauci as a, quote, revered epidemiologist. All right, first of all, he's not revered,
and
and
he's
he's
not even.
certainly not an epidemiologist.
So they're just, it's a typical lie. There's all lies. I mean, this whole, I heard a lie recently from a left-wing relative. Trump is deporting people who are illegal aliens, who have been here for 10 years and they get a job and they've done nothing wrong. First of all, they're here illegally. Why didn't they fix their citizenship status all these years? I don't know how they could live like that. But putting that aside, I looked into that, and that's a lie. He is not. That's not happening. The majority of people who are deported are either outright criminals or they call them collateral to criminal. In other words, they were they were seen, hanging out with the criminals, right? They're not absolutely convicted of being drug dealers, but they were with the drug dealers and they're here illegally. That's the majority of people who are being deported, and that the ICE is working directly with local police departments, including Boston, by the way, who actually does work with ICE quietly, and they give them the list of illegal aliens who are drug dealers, who are dangerous criminals, and they go after them. And if other people get swept up in it, then they probably, they're erring on the side of caution because they're probably involved if they're here illegally anyway. And so you have a huge, all the information about that are lies. And that's putting aside the fact that Obama actually deported a lot more people than Trump anyway. But anyway, so Mike, what do you have coming up on the Substack?
Well, I got a few things in the works. It's funny, I did get some comments on that SPLC. I guess a lot of people were unaware of the fact that what's his name, Morris Dees.
Oh yeah.
He was the campaign manager for George Wallace, or he was in that campaign, 1958.
Wow.
Right. So he was a total scumbag, and I'm not really sure how he even got all this support, other than the fact that liberals are really stupid. Apparently I could put up a sign saying, "I'm going to look for hate groups. Send me all your money." And that's what they did.
Well, that was a complete scam. And so isn't the ADL. They actually, now we know evidence that they actually were creating these hate groups, or they were at least enforcing, helping them get along with huge amounts of money.
Well, why didn't someone call out, what's his name? Greenbaum?
Oh, yeah. I know what you mean. The head of the ADL.
The ADL guy.
Right. I forget it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Jonathan.
Where are all the responsible Jews in B'nai B'rith to call this out? It's one of these things where, well, the guy's making a lot of money and his money goes to charity, so he's a good guy.
Or he's fighting anti-Semitism. We have to.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
And so, they don't look at the fact that a lot of this stuff is fanned in order to raise money, going all the way back to the Leo Frank trial, which was not the way it was portrayed. No. Leo Frank was a rapist and a murderer, convicted by several juries and upheld by several appeals. It wasn't because of anti-Semitism. The South really wasn't particularly anti-Semitic. They came down, you had these New York lawyers who set up the ADL in that case, who went down there, and they not only did they make this case, oh, this is anti-Semitic, but the poor man who was he was like the night watchman at the time that young Mary Phelan was raped and murdered. He was black, and they blamed him, and they go, look at that man, he's black. They tried to use racism to fan the flames against an innocent man. And the governor of that state, what was his name, Canton or something, he was in bed with the ADL. He got money from them. There's some relationship with them. And so he ended up commuting Leo Frank's sentence.
Yeah.
Leo Frank had been convicted of murder, and Leo Frank was let out of prison, and then shortly afterwards he was lynched. And so they, oh, look at it, he's a Jew, and
Yeah.
and that governor had to flee the
Farmer's a bitch, right?
the governor had to flee the state. He never returned.
Yeah, yeah.
He was so
But
angry.
yeah, that's, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story.
Sorry.
All
Anyway, but
right.
so onward and
So
upward.
everybody go on Amazon and get your book.
Yes, thank you very much. It's linked here. The Israel-Arab conflict. Will there be peace? I'll be tomorrow a guest of Brett Witherby from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'll be on at 4:30. He's got a pretty big show there, and we'll see. I'm doing some interviews, so
Good.
Anyway.
Well, good luck with that.
thank you, and I'll talk to you next week.
All right. Next time, same station.
Yes, and